Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us at the first public webinar series looking at the Gut Reaction Health Data Hub and how we are using health data for research into the causes and treatments for IBD. My name is Amanda Stranks, and I'm the Project Manager for the Patient and Public Involvement Workstream and your host for this series. Gut Reaction brings together expertise from across the IBD, research, patient involvement and data science fields to help us to get the most out of the excellent data resources that we have in the UK so that they can be used for research into IBD. Throughout this series, I'm going to be joined by different experts from within Gut Reaction to look at how the hub works and, crucially, to answer all of your questions. Today's webinar is going to look at the story of Gut Reaction so far. But later in the series, we will be joined by Sarah Sleet, the CEO of Crohn's and Colitis UK, and members of our Patient Advisory Committee to talk about how patients have been involved in the development and running of Gut Reaction and what questions that they would like to see answered through Gut Reaction. We'll also be joined by experts in data security and governance to take a detailed look at how we are keeping Gut Reaction data safe and private. And then later still in the series, we will be joined by Professor Miles Parks and other leading IBD clinicians to talk about their hopes and plans for Gut Reaction and the burning research questions that they think will be essential to tackle using its resources. Thank you to everyone who has submitted questions in advance for this event, and please do keep using that Q&A box to ask your questions as we go along. We'll try to get through as many questions as we can, though we may end up reserving some of them for future webinars if they'd be better answered by another of our experts. Please do be aware, though, that we can't answer personal medical questions, but we would really love to see your thoughts on what questions and topics that you think researchers should be looking at using Gut Reaction. So enough from me, time to introduce our speakers for today. Today, I'm joined by Professor John Bradley, who is the Director of Gut Reaction, the Chief Investigator of the NIHR Bioresource, and Director of Research at Cambridge University Hospitals and Cambridge University Health Partners, among other things. I'm also joined by Mark Avery, who is the Director of Health Informatics for Eastern Academic Health Science Network and Cambridge University Health Partners, and also the operational lead for Gut Reaction. So good morning to you both, and thank you very much for joining us today.
Good morning.
Mark, we're going to start with you. So Gut Reaction was initially awarded the funding in 2019 by Health Data Research UK, or HDR UK as we say, through UK Research and Innovation. Could you give us a little bit of background about how and why the hub was started and what led to the development of the hub program? And I think you have a few slides that you're able to share with us.
I'll give a quick overview. I won't spend too long on the sort of the slides in this introduction. But it'd be good to set the scene about where we are. So in terms of focusing on inflammatory bowel disease, in the main, we're talking about ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease as the two main forms. These are chronic and sort of ongoing lifelong conditions leading to abdominal pain, anemia, so reduced number of blood cells, weight loss, diarrhea, and in a number of cases, both for ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease, ultimately this can lead to severe abdominal surgery, leading to a major impact on people's quality of life, relationships, the general issues about sort of going out and about, particularly when there's a flare. So it affects around 500,000 people across the UK. So we're talking around 1 in 130 of the population. And treatment, well, symptoms vary from individual to individual, as do responses to treatment. And the reasons for this aren't, generally understood. Arriving at the optimal treatment plan for individual patients can be a sort of an iterative or a developing sort of process, and really we're focused on using data to help get to a diagnosis and optimal treatment plans, and even develop new treatments for patients with IBD as our core aim. So in terms of the focus on data, there's a huge amount of data out there from various sources. primary care records, so GP health records, hospital records, data from patients themselves about their lifestyle, how the disease is progressing in individual cases. So there's an awful lot of data out there with huge potential for gaining insights into IBD. But there are lots of barriers to its use. So it sits in a number of different locations. The format of the data can vary. There are ethical and safety concerns about making sure that that the data are used properly and safely, maximizing the insights that we can gain, but protecting the privacy of individuals. So recognizing the potential benefit for health data research across all areas of health, Health Data Research UK was formed in response to the life science industrial strategy originally, so funded by UK Research Innovation and the Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund. Health Data Research UK itself was set up and funded to look at what we can do better across the UK to support health data research. And one of their first initiatives was to launch this what was originally termed the Digital Innovation Hub programme that has become the Health Data Research Hub programme. I mentioned the 500,000 UK population. In terms of the data that we are looking at here with the gut reaction programme, we are building on the data provided by participants. So these are patients who have enrolled in the NIHR bioresource and the IBD bioresource specifically. So there's around 35,000 patients now from 100 hospitals UK-wide that are part of the IBD bioresource, and all of those patients have given their specific and informed consent for their health data to be used for research purposes. We're also working on the Hub programme with the UK IBD Registry, which is a largely de-identified data resource currently, but they are themselves going through a consent process. The registry, the UK IBD Registry database, is now recognised as a research database in its own right, and they'll be going through a consenting programme and hopefully offering further opportunities for linkage there. But essentially, as part of the Hub, we've been building on that 35,000 or so in the IBD bioresource, and then working with a specific set of NHS trusts to supplement the data that's held already with more granular data about patients' treatment over time, diagnosis information, diagnostic imaging, pathology or lab test results, and the like, to be able to build on some of the core data that's held. So all of the participants in the bioresource have provided either blood or saliva samples from which their DNA can be sequenced. So we have genomic data available on the participants alongside research data and hospital data. So the Hub started in 2019, building on the NIHR bioresource participants, as I've said, and really the work that we've been doing as a Hub is to build on and evolve that data resource, and we've been working very closely with patients to inform the design and processes for selecting which areas of research that we prioritise and how we make decisions about that. Clearly, very close links with academia and also industry. And again, I think the critical point about industry and commercial involvement, and it's a sensitive area, but essentially the actual sort of development of new treatments or new drugs for IBD will be developed by commercial organisations. So the partnerships there are also key, but we need to make sure that we're doing that in a way that people are happy and comfortable with. So we've got three aims from a Hub point of view: building on the consented data that's in the bioresource, building the technical infrastructure for what we call a TRE, which is a trustworthy research environment. But this is a technical environment that allows data scientists to analyse the data within a secure space without taking that data away. So only the specific data to answer specific approved questions are provided. And we want to demonstrate that this model of working is acceptable across the stakeholder groups, but most importantly with patients and the public, that we've got a model that's scalable, replicable, and ultimately financially sustainable. So this slide is actually one of my own pieces of research looking into patient and public attitudes to data sharing with commercial organisations. And this particular slide is showing the relationships between the extent to which people support the use of health data, de-identified health data for research, and the relationship that has with the perceived benefit for others. And I think this is absolutely key and central to what we're doing and the messaging around it, because you can see here by the sort of the concentration of dots in the bottom left-hand corner here, that the support for health data research, particularly by commercial organisations, steps up really quite significantly when people can see the connection and they have confidence that the research will lead to achieving benefits for others. And that's absolutely central to our theme. So with that in mind, the central convening theme around all of our engagement with all stakeholders is focusing on the benefits to patients. The 4 Ps there are not my invention. They sort of dubbed by the P4 Institute, which is based in Seattle in the US. But actually it gives a really neat model for, everything we're doing should in some way lead to supporting the prevention of disease, predicting its onset or flares, improving individual participation in the management of their disease, and developing more personalised approaches to treatment. And if we're going to do that in a sustainable way, as I say, this is the third aim of the hub, we need to be doing that in a way, that's the central convening theme, if you like, that brings together the interests of individual participants, without whom this work can't happen at all. The NHS organisations we're engaged with, and the other stakeholder groups summarised there. The last point I just wanted to make is just to highlight the organisations that are involved in this partnership. The distribution of NHS trusts on the left-hand side there.
My next question already starts feeding into some of the questions that we're getting from the audience. So thank you so much to everyone in the audience that's already putting questions in. So John, this question's for you. The NIHR bioresource already does quite a lot of research in IBD through what we call the IBD bioresource. Could you tell us perhaps a little bit of background of about what the bioresource does, and where the idea for gut reaction came from? How does it build on what we already have?
The NIHR bioresource was set up really to facilitate and accelerate medical research. The idea is that people who want to be involved in medical research tell us about their health and lifestyle. They allow us to access their medical records, and they give us a sample, usually blood or saliva. Mm-hmm. And from that, one of the things we can do is undertake genetic analysis. It started as a general population resource, but we've built cohorts in disease areas. And the first common disease we undertook at scale is inflammatory bowel disease. Mm-hmm. Now, once we have all the information that patients provide, then what we can do, if there are research studies that they may be suitable for, we can contact them to see if they're interested in participating. Mm-hmm. So that's the way we accelerate medical research. But what we've become aware of is that we are accumulating an awful lot of data on people, both people from the general population without necessarily health problems, but also those within the disease cohorts. And that data in itself is of tremendous value and can be used to understand much more about diseases. Now, more recently, Health Data Research UK was established. Mm-hmm. And has been looking at ways that they can support use of health data for research. And so the concept that they set up a number of hubs looking at particular areas was developed, and we applied and were successful in receiving funding to establish the HDI UK Health Data Research Hub Gut Reaction. It became obvious that this would be even more powerful if we worked with the UK IBD registry, which, as Marcus touched on, is another organization which is collecting health data in people with inflammatory bowel disease. So we're joining up the IBD Bioresource, the UK IBD registry, under the umbrella of Health Data Research UK, which is a much wider organization, to form Gut Reaction and use data from patients with inflammatory bowel disease to better understand their disease.
So we're taking all of these research resources that already exist and kind of joining them up better to try and help our research. That makes a lot of sense. Thank you. Mark, the next question is for you again. So we saw from your description of the hub, and even as we've been talking about it so far and some of the questions that are coming in, that Gut Reaction is quite a big and challenging program to run. Could you explain your role a little bit further as Director of Informatics, and also tell us a bit about how the Eastern Academic Health Science Network got involved?
We got involved originally as a forerunner to the Digital Innovation Hub program. Health Data Research UK launched a series of sprint innovation projects to demonstrate capabilities that would support health data research at scale. And very early on in the development of that, John and I had a sit down, actually looking at some rare diseases data to start with, to develop a sort of a proof of concept around, can we bring together hospital data, research data, and genomic data in a secure research environment that sort of ring fences where the data can take place. So really, the origins of the program came from that sort of successful demonstrator that this could be done, and working with IBD is the sort of the initial attempt, and it's been quite successful, I think, but actually developing that model at scale. So that's where it came from an academic health science network point of view. So this is the AHSN that I work for, but I'm also the Director of Health Informatics for Cambridge University Health Partners, which is a academic health science centre. And essentially, these organisations are about supporting discovery, but then turning information or knowledge and supporting the development of new treatments from that. So whether that's adoption and spread of new innovations, or working with industry to help them develop new approaches. So that's a particular approach. Our role has been around identifying and convening the partners, and then the sometimes fairly complex area of project management, working on the interdependencies between how do we marry up the technical development of what we're doing and the technical solutions, doing so in a way that patients and the public are helpful, are supportive of, and in a way that works for the data scientists, be they from academia or industry, in terms of the way they interact with that data. So we need to keep it safe, but we also need to make it usable, and there are a lot of sort of trade-offs that we need to make along the way to make sure that it works optimally. So
you're tasked with trying to bring all these rogue experts together and make sense of it all, and then turn these ideas into reality.
Indeed, cat herding.
Simple as that. Fantastic, thanks. It's clear that uniting this data, and indeed our experts, is quite a technical challenge. But often in some of the talk that we do around data and things like that, we also talk about improving data. And I've even heard of it being called curated, which sounds a bit like an art project. Could you please just talk a little bit about what it means to improve data? Because we're not making it up or anything, are we? How are we improving it? And what does it mean to curate data? Why is that important?
Data sits in different locations. And even if a data set on a particular subject, let's take blood results, for example, might be held in different fields or columns by each organisation, Some of the measurements might be in different units. Some of the way activity is described might be different. So a core activity under the umbrella of what we call data curation can be around standardizing the data so that we make sure that if we're comparing two data sets, we're comparing apples with apples. Another really key area is this concept of metadata, and without getting too complicated, but this is how do we manage the data about the data. If we've got research insights or analysis further downstream that's relied on particular things, being able to trace that data back to where it came from originally is important. If there are any clarification questions, for example. The organization and storage of the data set, where we are standardizing things, making sure that we've recorded exactly what we've done so that we can trace that back where we need to. But I think one of the really key things here is this concept of what we call data discovery, because somebody with a research question that they want to ask, we're not saying, right, well, that's a good research question, here, have access to all of the data that we've got. We are just making the data that is required to be able to answer a particular question. Once that's approved, we're making that data available within the research environment. It's important for a researcher coming to the hub to be able to understand if there is enough data available to answer the specific question that they want to ask. So if they want to look at a particular gender, age group, diagnosis, how many people within the database meet the criteria, and that can help them shape the research question that they would like to ask.
John, going back to you then, one of the really great things that we've done through Gut Reaction so far has been working really closely with our patients. Could you explain how and why patients became involved in this program, and what do you think they've really added?
Obviously, patients are and volunteers are central to the bioresource, and so we have always developed the bioresource with input from patients and the public. That's become even more important when we're dealing with health data. And I think we've seen that at a national level over a number of areas. Broadly, there are two ways that the patients have been involved. One, which Mark alluded to, is defining generally the sort of research that we can and should do and that patients will support. So getting their views on commercial research and how we support that. So that's developing the sort of broad concepts that we have. And then very specifically, patients are involved in each individual application to use health data, and we'll review that alongside our technical and clinical experts. So absolutely essential, shaping the bioresource and the gut reaction hub, and then looking at individual projects.
So patients play a really important role in deciding which studies take place using this patient data. So Mark, although we are going to be having this session on data safety, could you just give us a brief overview of how we keep gut reaction data safe?
The data that we're holding as part of the hub is sort of physically held at a data center in Liverpool. This is working with one of the partners, Ames, who have a very secure building within a building, which holds the servers where the data is held, and all sorts of internationally recognized sort of accreditations for the level of sort of security in terms of technically how the data is held. So there are a whole series of I suppose other issues there about, I touched on it earlier, but this sort of balancing the utility of the data with the need to protect individual privacy. For the most part, researchers are very, very interested in patient level data, but not necessarily knowing who that patient is. And I think it was one of the questions that was raised in the chat, but I think George was talking about, right, well, if we're linking data between two sources, then how do we go about that? And essentially, we've got a process called pseudonymization, but it's replacing the identifying data within a data set with a code that is specific to that individual. And where we've got things like an NHS number and a date of birth and things, we can pull those data together and encode it. And if you run that across two separate data sets, where your pseudonymization code matches, you know that you can match the data on the same patient, but without actually sharing any identifiable information. So that issue of sort of de-identification or pseudonymization and linkage is absolutely key to how we're linking data together to make it useful, but protecting privacy, as I say. So other safeguards are particularly focused on making sure that we're doing research that people support, and that, again, without repeating what I said earlier, but that ties back to the really core sort of benefits focus, and making sure that patients and the public are involved in the decision making of about which research applications are supported.
One of the other things that we've been talking a lot about, or in research generally, but also in data research, is all around quality and diversity and making sure that our data is representative of the wider population. John, could you tell us a little bit around how we're trying to make sure that the data that is in gut reaction is reflective of the population, and indeed how Bioresource is going about doing that?
This is really important both for Bioresource and gut reaction. Again, there are various approaches to this. The one is to make sure that we raise awareness in underrepresented communities of the Bioresource and the gut reaction, so that people know that they can become involved. Mm-hmm. As important is actually making sure that we take gut reaction and the Bioresource to the areas where those populations are. Mm-hmm. Looking at, for example, hospitals where communities that are perhaps underrepresented in research are overrepresented in the local community, and making sure that we are recruiting in those areas. And as we expand the program, that's something that we're particularly keen to do and have done with the most recent hospitals that we're enrolling into gut reaction.
It's exciting to see, I think, all of the different data that's coming in and seeing it become increasingly reflective of exactly the types of people we want to be taking part in research. Speaking now as a doctor and a researcher, John, what do you think that health data research can offer in addition to traditional clinical research?
One of the real interests is that it provides what we sometimes call real world data. Mm-hmm. Clinical trial data is absolutely essential for knowing whether a drug works or not. But it's not necessarily reflective of what is happening in the real world, in that often the criteria for entering a clinical trial are quite restricted, and so are less easy to generalize into the population. With the gut reaction, then we can look across populations and learn about people who have received or are receiving certain drugs and their effectiveness. And indeed, the long-term goal is that we will be able to survey responses to drugs over a longer period of time after the clinical trials are finished. So one of the key aspects is that we are seeing this so-called real-world data. The other is that it doesn't need the patients to actually be involved in a clinical trial. We can learn simply from their health data.
That makes sense. So we can be doing research all the time in real time, just using patients going about their everyday treatments and things like that. Do you think, have you found that that approach is popular amongst your sort of fellow clinicians and healthcare staff? Are you excited about that possibility?
There is a lot of excitement about that. And obviously the two need to be undertaken in parallel. When we're looking at a new therapy, then that has to be considered through a clinical trial, although people are looking at ways that we can perhaps accelerate or simplify that. But once a drug is introduced, then there is so much more we can learn about it. And which patients in particular it might benefit.
Mark, I suppose in a similar vein to that, so the aim of gut reaction is to improve treatment options for the IBD community. And you sort of alluded to this a bit in your introductory slides, actually. But we know that we have to work with both academic and commercial organisations in order to be able to do this, and we're excited about the possibilities. But also, as some people have alluded to, and I think we've seen some things in the chat already, some members of the public are a bit concerned sometimes around the involvement of commercial organisations. What would you say your views are on this, and why do we think it's really important to also work with commercial organisations as well as academics?
So yeah, and understand the sensitivities here, you know, and it's a really important area, and an area that we spend an awful lot of time talking about, and we've spent, you know, many hours with the patient advisory committee sort of debating these issues as well. I think one of the easiest ways of describing it is that, you know, I suppose we can be looking at two different sorts of outputs here. So generally, you know, research can lead to improved understanding of underlying sort of causes or development of disease or response to treatments that can just lead to you know, knowledge, if you like, that enables doctors to act differently or make different decisions or prescribe different existing things at different points. But actually, and this is where some of the work with the Sanger Institute and a chap called Carl Anderson, who heads up the sort of inflammatory disease group at the Sanger. So, and I think he, for example, has been personally involved in the identification of you know, over 200 genetic markers or indicators that appear to have an association with IBD. Mm-hmm. And actually, when new things are discovered and new links are discovered, then this opens up all sorts of possibilities for the development of new treatments. Mm. And that needs to be done working with either, you know, medtech companies or pharmaceutical companies to develop treatments that you know, that can exploit, if you like, that link that wasn't previously known. Mm. And I think really that's one of the most exciting things about the hub and the way that it works. Because there are very, very few examples out there. There's, you know, the Genomics England exists and the 100,000 Genomes Project and other things. Mm-hmm. But in terms of being able to look at that genomic data alongside real world health data and how disease progresses and the kind of interventions that are needed to be provided at which stage in the disease, starts, you know, making all sorts of insights that previously wouldn't have been possible, and that's really one of the big motivating factors for all of us to get involved in doing this.
Because ultimately what we're looking for is to improve treatments for people with IBD and to make sure that those benefits get through.
Indeed, and without sounding too trite, if you like, but, you know, everything that exists in the NHS that isn't people, mm-hmm, has been, you know, from the computers we use to the chairs we sit on to the drugs that get prescribed, you know, all of these things are developed and built by commercial organizations. You know, we just need to make sure that we're, you know, interacting safely, and particularly where the use of data are involved. As I say, we're doing in a way that is ethical and acceptable to people.
And that patients are central to driving that journey.
Absolutely.
Right, so we are now more than halfway through the initial funding period from Health Data Research UK. John, could you tell us a bit about Gut Reaction's progress so far and what we hope to achieve this year?
So in the early stages, what we were keen to do was make sure that we did actually collate the data, curate it in the way that we've discussed, and that has been successful. So we're now focusing very much on the use of the data, and actually helping to better understand and treat inflammatory bowel disease. And so we're keen now, and we're seeing increasing numbers of projects coming forward to actually work with the data, or to work with the IBD bioresource.
When do you think we might start getting some of the answers come from some of those things, do you think?
There are obviously there are a lot of different projects ongoing. in some cases, there already has been utility in using the data. An example would be the COVID-19 risk tool that has been developed by the IBD registry to help people with inflammatory bowel disease understand their risk from COVID-19. Smaller steps are looking at genetic linkage between variants in the genetics of different people and susceptibility to inflammatory bowel disease, or the likelihood of different outcomes. So we're starting to make those discoveries. We are still at a relatively early stage.
Mark, the next question actually picks up on another question that we've seen so far in the chat. And so we know gut reaction is all around driving innovation in IBD and improving treatment options, as I said. Is there anything more widely that we've been learning for the data field as a whole? Is it going to have impacts outside of the field of IBD?
We've learned an awful lot as we go, as we have been through this process and talked to more and more people. And I think part of that is how we present information about the data. And I touched on this point of metadata earlier, but to describe what we've got and the kind of research that's available to people. Some of the main lessons learned are how that then works with the technical infrastructure and the core messaging about what we're doing. So I think that one of the biggest gains in all of this is that if we can demonstrate as I think we will be able to do, that this model is sustainable, then the ability to replicate that kind of approach across other disease areas is definitely there. It might be more appropriate for John to talk to a bit of this, but the IBD bioresource is just one area within the wider NIHR bioresource, and there's potential application across other disease areas locally, as well as a model for others. But I don't know, John, if you'd like to say any more.
Broadly, yes, I mean the NIHR bioresource does encompass a number of different diseases. I think the reason why, one of the reasons why inflammatory bowel disease was chosen as the first common disease we would look at, and the reason why there is so much interest, is that there clearly are genetic factors that influence the susceptibility and outcome of inflammatory bowel disease. And those factors are likely to provide a steer to which treatments are going to work best in which patients. And that's the ultimate goal. We think, obviously, there is the term inflammatory bowel disease that encompasses Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis. But even within those diseases, there are almost certainly subcategories with different origins and different likelihood of response to treatments. And that's what we ultimately want to unravel. I think one of the participants before this said it seemed like a bit of a lottery as to which treatment worked. And that's true. And that's because for different patients, different treatments are likely to work better. And that's what we want to understand and predict. But you can do that in two ways. One is by developing a trial in which you select the patients who you think are going to be susceptible to a treatment. And that doesn't happen very much at the moment. We have, through other aspects of the bioresource, worked on that with pharmaceutical companies. And then the other is to survey people who are receiving the treatment and see if those that we think might respond better do so. And that's where simply looking at the real world data can help.
Well, it's an exciting prospect. So would you say if we started small initially with rare diseases and we've got bigger to IBD through gut reaction, that the next step then might be health conditions more widely, where we suspect that there's a strong genetic component that by tying in sort of further data might give us sort of more some further information?
Yes, and we already are looking at other disease areas, and there's some overlap. So we have a mental health bioresource, and a lot of people again, have expressed interest in whether we're looking at the mental health aspects of inflammatory bowel disease. We're looking at other areas, other immune-mediated diseases, and again, there is going to be overlap. Something else that somebody's put in the chat with inflammatory bowel disease. So we work very closely across those disease boundaries. Non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, another disease area that we're looking at. So we are broadening this all the time.
Someone earlier had sort of asked a question around collection of mental health data. So do we already have mental health data through the bioresource that we could use? And I know that there's also a mental health data hub, isn't there? So would there be any potential, do you think, for collaboration with them later on?
Yes, we are looking at studies that would look at the impact of inflammatory bowel disease on mental health. But as I think has been alluded to, we have to be very careful, because if we are going to do that, we have to make sure that the necessary support is available to people while we're doing it. But we have the relevant expertise because of the fact that we have the mental health bioresource.
Okay, so that's all the questions that I had. So we can start having a look even deeper into some of the ones that are coming in from the audience. And just again, a huge thank you to the audience for all of the questions that are coming through. They look really interesting. So to start with one of the ones at the top, John, you said before that we've already starting to get some study requests through gut reaction. Are there any types of research that gut reaction would say no to, that we wouldn't allow to take place?
The answer is yes, and obviously that's where we have the review process, and where that does involve patients. And I guess they would fall into a number of different categories. The first is where we know there is overlap with studies that are already taking place, so that we're not duplicating work. And there we would often point the researchers or applicants to the existing study and see if they can work alongside those researchers. The second would be where we have looked at the study and think that technically it is not feasible. For example, if the statistical analysis doesn't add up, we don't think the study is powered to answer the question that it is designed to. And then there would be studies where we would be concerned, and there are some we're working through with our patient group at the moment, because we may uncover information through the study that we would need to feed back to patients. And there we need to understand what the patient's views on that, and whether they would want to be part of such a study, and how we go about the consent process. So the answer is yes, and there are quite a range of ways in which we might be concerned and not agree to a study taking place.
And you alluded to a review process. So every time an application is submitted, what happens to those applications then?
So that's something that actually we're working with our patient group at the moment to streamline and make sure that we've got all the appropriate safeguards and review processes in place. But essentially, it will go to our data access committee, who will look at it from all of those aspects: the ethical, the technical, the feasibility. And if they have any concerns, then it goes to a national steering committee for review.
And lots of layers of security then, as it were. Very interesting. We've said quite a few on Mark's slides, and John, you've mentioned it a bit, that patients give their consent to join gut reaction, or rather they give their consent to join the bioresource, and that's how their data ends up in gut reaction. Does anyone ever change their mind? Is it possible for people to take their data back out again, or to ask for it to stop being used?
We're very clear that people can change their mind, and occasionally they do. It doesn't happen very often, and we would remove their data, not make it accessible to researchers if that was the case.
I think that would be quite reassuring for a lot of the people who would otherwise be wondering about whether or not they wish to take part. One of the other questions we've had through is, do you have to pay to use gut reaction data? Do people make money off it? Do we make money off of it?
For academic researchers, then the answer is no. For commercial companies, then we recover the costs of providing the data to them. So we're not making money from the commercial company, but we are making sure that the costs that have been involved in collecting that data and providing it to them are recovered from the commercial company.
Mark, did you want to add anything to that? You look like you were going to say something before.
Yeah, one of the key areas of discussion, really, and there are wider activities, and we've obviously built some technical infrastructure here to support what we're doing. So, but I think that the perception around well, as John says, recovering costs, but in the world of data research, that includes storage and data processing and any curation costs that are required, and sometimes whether there are other data sets that we might be linking to, there might be a separate application process, and there could be sort of costs associated in some circumstances with that. So in a similar way, actually, as if people were applying for data to NHS Digital, who hold data on behalf of the NHS, but they offer a similar, or operate a similar model.
There's a really interesting question that's come in from George, who comments that there are lots of different places that a patient could be asked to sign up or join or register. Do you think that there will ever be a time where patients would be able to register at a single point and just be able to kind of take part in all of these things?
And this is a really, really good question, and and an interesting model. So, I mean, clearly it would make sense if we could manage things in one place. I think one of the key issues around data and research is that the purposes can be so diverse. It's really, really important that people have line of sight to to be able to understand how their data is being used. And just because consent is given for one thing, it might not be given for other things. So if we take the consent model at the bioresource, for example, there's a consenting sort of process. It's not just a form that people do online, but the recruitment happens in clinic, in NHS hospitals, for the most part, sitting down with a research nurse who can take people very, very carefully through the consent process so that they understand each element that people are being signed up to, but also have the opportunity to ask questions, and a cooling off period, and the opportunity to withdraw at any time, as John has already described. I think one of the really nice and assuring or reassuring things about the way the bioresource operates is that where there is something new that you're not sure whether patients would want to participate in or not, or it's outside of the that original sort of consent agreement, there is the ability within the bioresource, and people consent to be contacted about further research studies that they might be interested in. So I think having a sort of a core population that are interested in participating in research, and then the opportunity to engage in things more specifically, if that's different, is important. So I think that the question that I think was asked in the chat about that, it's a really interesting model, but it would be really quite complex to give people all the sort of the modular choices to cover all of the research that might want to be done. And I think transparency about how data is used is really important if we're to keep people's confidence, really.
So sort of something about balancing convenience and choice, and making sure that people are being able to be clear around what they're happy to have done with what data and why. But we do also work quite closely with some of the other common areas that they might be asked, don't we, John? So we work with IBD Registry, for example. We're working with NHS trusts and other places. And would we, as a hub, be open if we identified another source of IBD data somewhere? Would we be open with working with sort of further data holders, would you say, John and Mark?
The answer is yes, and we're continually looking at this. But for the reasons Mark has outlined, it can really only be done prospectively. Mm-hmm. So, for example, we are continually having a dialogue with Genomics England, who we've worked very closely with, to see if we can align our consents so that the infrastructure and resources available across both organisations can be used, and likewise with other organisations. But the consent issue is the really important one. And so if we're going to do it retrospectively, that would almost always involves some sort of re-consent process, so that people are aware what's happening. Obviously, it's much easier if we're looking prospectively.
And when you say retrospectively here, you mean if we came up with a new idea of what we wanted to do with data, but that's not what we'd said we were going to do with it in the first place, we'd have to go back and ask again whether or not people minded.
Or sharing the data across another organization. So a key example would be in the rare diseases field, where we worked very closely with Genomics England, who were doing whole genome sequencing as we were. And so we re-consented quite a number of people so that data could be shared across the organizations.
No, I was just going to jump in on that point and just using an example from a conversation this week, but we myself and John and the bioresource team had a conversation this week about polygenic risk scores, for example, which, without going into that in sort of detail now, but we discussed it with the patient advisory committee, and views varied. So some people were very keen and supportive, and other people weren't. And that has affected the route by which that might be taken forward. For example. So I mean, that's an example this week of how patient feedback has affected the route by which we look at doing things.
And I suppose also the importance of having different people have their own options to make their own choices, because even different patients think differently about sort of the same topic, as it were. We have a question from Lena, who says, are we communicating with other researchers who are working, for example, on autoimmune diseases? So we sort of covered this a little bit, but John, do you want to just briefly touch on that again?
I mentioned that we're establishing an immune-mediated inflammatory disease bioresource. So the answer is we do make sure that we work across different disease areas. And actually, often the researchers themselves are broadly interested in autoimmune diseases, of which one might be inflammatory bowel disease, but they may also be looking at other disease areas. And there's no doubt we can learn from that, particularly in terms of genetic susceptibility.
We've got a question from Berenice, who says, do you think there will be a way to turn off further damage? I think she's talking about immune damage here in inflammatory bowel disease. Is that the kind of question that we'd be able to look at through gut reaction?
A lot of the pathways that we're trying to uncover and learn about involve the immune system, particular cells of the immune system, particular molecules involved in the immune system. And a lot of the currently available therapies for inflammatory bowel disease target those particular pathways. And yes, we hope we can turn off that immune inflammation. And actually the bowel has a very good ability to recover from inflammation.
We have a question from someone who has asked, can their child with IBD join gut reaction?
We are in the process of very close to establishing the young people's IBD bioresource, which actually will be part of a much wider young people's bioresource. One of the underrepresented groups in terms of medical research is children and young people. And so we have started and will be launching later this year to create a young people's bioresource. Part of that will be recruitment through schools of young people who are interested broadly in participating in medical research. And part of it will be looking at children with particular diseases. And again, the first that we will be looking at is inflammatory bowel disease. So the answer is not today, but very soon, yes.
Another exciting prospect. Are there any different considerations with children and data more widely?
There's a dual consent process, or often a consent and assent process that is needed, in that we would need the parents' consent as well as the child's consent or assent. Even within that, we would develop material and consent processes that are targeted at different age groups.
And I imagine working with patients and their families would be particularly important for that process as well, to make sure we get it right.
Yes.
Mark, more widely in sort of the data field, through what you've seen through informatics, is using child data for research. Do you think that's becoming more common? Is that sort of something that's being talked about?
Oh, it's certainly being talked about more and more. And I think if you'll forgive me getting sort of excited about the complexity of it, but actually the rules about doing that in a, again, an ethical and a sustainable way, and again, John and the team and the wider sort of Young People's Biro is also looking at these things, but it gets complicated in terms of the point at which patients are making decisions on their child's behalf, and the point at which children should and can be making decisions on their on their own. And I think that's one of the key areas of complexity about making sure that we do this in a, again, sensible and sustainable way that safeguards individuals and takes individual views into account. And there are obviously tricky situations if a parent would like their child to participate, but the child is less keen, or vice versa, and how you use those things is not particularly straightforward. But there are different things that apply at different ages. So yes, I mean it's complex. It has huge potential, and if you go back to our original aims about prevention and trying to get upstream of disease, then obviously data, capturing data early, and that includes early in life, potentially has huge value. So yeah, it's a tricky one to work through, but critically important, I think. Probably
another question with a similarly wide-ranging answer is we have a person who has asked whether or not there is a link with COVID-19.
Yes, I think this followed on from talking about the COVID-19 tool. With people with diseases such as inflammatory bowel disease, particularly where they're receiving immunosuppressive treatments, there was obviously a concern, or is a concern, that they might be more susceptible to COVID-19 and that it might actually alter the course of the disease. And that's where we collated a lot of information from patients around COVID-19. It is quite complex because in people who suffer from severe illness with COVID-19, it is often thought to be the overreaction of the immune system that causes that severity of the illness. And obviously we've got good evidence for that now, in that steroids in people with severe illness and at a later stage in the disease are beneficial and can save lives. So it's a complex area. It's not that patients with inflammatory bowel disease are going to be more likely to catch COVID-19. It's whether the course of the disease would be different. And the accumulated data so far suggests that actually there isn't a higher risk of severe illness, but it's something that we're continually monitoring. Obviously, patients with inflammatory bowel disease understandably have been very cautious during the pandemic.
Mark, would you say that the pandemic has kind of driven the data field forward quite quickly in your experience?
Purely in terms of this project, it's been a bit of a double-edged sword, really. So, I mean, the socialization of data and the presentation of findings, to the public on a routine basis, has been part of the as part of the mainstream media in a way that it never has before. So I think the public connections and the perceptions around the value of data actually affecting how we respond in a particular sort of healthcare situation has been really key. So again, if we're going back to this point I was making at the beginning about people needing to see the connection between, actually, if I'm sharing my data, what's the value to me, what's the transaction, what do I get in return, if you like, and that line of sight to public benefit is absolutely key. So that's been really helpful. Where it hasn't been helpful to us is obviously we're working with a number of NHS trusts on the data, and the researchers and gastroenterologists working at those sites, and the pandemic has had a huge impact on their ability to be able to do that. So by the same token, we probably haven't made as much progress with as many trusts as we would have been able to in normal, in inverted circumstances, if normal exists anymore. Yes, if it weren't for the pandemic, then we could have progressed sort of conversations with individual NHS trusts further. I think in terms of the wider public perception and understanding of the uses and applications of data, there is an appreciation now like never before, I think.
We've got a really interesting question that's come through for Pauline that, again, you might both like to speak to. She says, as a person with Crohn's or colitis who is not registered with a hospital specialist, her data is unlikely to be available sort of through our standard means. How could data from a person like herself be kind of made available for research? How might she be able to join in?
I'll jump in on this one first. So actually, if you look at the areas where the UK IBD registry is developing at the moment, one of the areas that they are particularly looking at are, and please forgive the acronyms, but sort of PROMs and PREMs. So this is patient-reported outcome measures and experience measures. Yeah. So it is all well and good being able to collect data from hospitals about people's treatment and diagnostic results and and the like, but not all the most important outcomes for patients are the ones that can be measured clinically. So those patient-reported outcomes are of huge interest if we're wanting to make a difference in a way that affects people's lives, in terms of mobility, independence, pain, all those sorts of things that can be more subjective. So again, this also goes back to the point about people enrolling in different places for different purposes, and that is a particular area that that the registry will be looking at in the future for example. So I think I guess that would be a particular message there, and keep an eye out for sort of communications and a bit of a recruitment or consent campaign to be coming from the UK IBD registry sometime soon.
And I imagine it would be particularly useful to be able to have data from people who kind of fit in that symptom area of Crohn's and colitis to help us understand more widely. So looking through our question list, and again, we've still got lots of questions coming through, which is wonderful. We talked earlier about how gut reaction brings different experts together. We have a question that asks, do we ever approach researchers to do projects for us?
I suppose if I jump in first. So we're very fortunate. So our clinical lead for inflammatory bowel disease on the hub is Professor Miles Parks, who's the principal investigator on the IBD bioresource, but he also is a founder and the current chair of the UK IBD Genetics Consortium. And he's worked closely with the lead investigators at the trusts, the NHS trusts who are engaged with the IBD bioresource. So the academic network through that route is really strong. So our approach is, and they're the experts really. So I guess our approach with that group has been to try and improve how we can describe the data that are available, and in what quantities, and really talking with that group on a reasonably regular basis about their priorities for research, and the data that we've got available and what the best fit might be, but also what their priorities are. So we have a lot of data and a lot of curation that could be done, but how do we prioritize that work to meet the need of what might be most valuable to researchers first? So it's more, I think, it's more a dialogue, I think, rather than us saying this is a specific question that we want to get answered. The only exception to that rule, perhaps, and Amanda, you yourself could probably talk to this one, is about how we support. If there's an area of research that patients themselves feel is important to pursue, how we go about that, and there are mechanisms to support. And I know, and that's something that you and colleagues have been helping us with too. So I guess that's the main area where we might go out looking for a specific question. Otherwise it's a dialogue, I think. And
we are very much so. We've got 2 webinars, as I mentioned earlier, where we kind of look at both sides of that project, that problem. Sorry. So the very next webinar to our audience is all about how patients have been involved in gut reaction already, and particularly what type of questions our patient advisory committee and you as the audience would like to see us answering, and perhaps topic areas if you don't have a specific question. And then we have another webinar later on in the series towards the end, where we are going to be speaking directly to Professor Parks has agreed to join that one, and hopefully some of the other clinicians from the IBD field to kind of look at those things. And patients, of course, as the audience, will also be invited to that, because we would really like to bring sort of those two meetings of minds, as it were, together to kind of hash out. Because as you say, sometimes knowing where to start with these enormous amounts of data, Mark, is kind of one of our challenges, isn't it? And which data do we clean up and curate first? More questions coming in, really interesting questions coming from the audience. And we've got one from Joan that says, do we have more interest from academic researchers or pharmaceutical companies? And do they ask for different types of data?
Currently, we're certainly supporting more studies from academic researchers than industry. But we recognize that if we're going to develop new treatments, we need to work with industry. And so we are investing a lot of time in trying to develop research proposals where we're working with industry. It's to a certain extent new territory. So it is involving a lot of meetings, a lot of thinking through the logistics, the contractual arrangements. But we are seeing an awful lot of interest from industry that we hope will translate in the future into research studies using the gut reaction data.
Mark, did you want to add anything to that?
I think it was also picking up on just some of the new technologies in that. So I guess part of the particular areas of industry focus that we're seeing are around potential applications of artificial intelligence and machine learning, for example, for unstructured text or diagnostic image analysis. So I guess to address the part of the question that was asking about from themes from that we're getting from different directions, but there's quite a lot of interest there from industry, and then if we particularly on the med tech side, and then from pharma, the real world record data alongside the genomics, as I touched on earlier, is a recurring theme. And to be fair, then on the academic side, they tend to be really broad ranging, covering all of those things.
We've got another question about what will happen to patient data at the end of gut reaction.
We don't envisage there necessarily being an end. There are examples of many of these data repositories that have been going for many years. Clearly, if there was an end, then the data would need to be destroyed. But I don't envisage that happening. It is essential that if we are holding the data, it is under a framework that has the appropriate governance, the appropriate ethics. But as long as they're in place, then I would envisage it continuing.
I think that makes sense, and hope that long may it continue. Get lots of research done, hopefully. We've had a question about, could we share details of how I can join gut reaction? So
a couple of different routes here. So in terms of enrolment in the NIHR bioresource, John might want to say more about the sort of the wider healthier participants sort of bioresource, but where people can just contact the bioresource themselves to sign up. But I think in terms of the gut reaction work, we're obviously working with a specific set of NHS trusts. So the recruitment sort of through that route and through outpatient clinics is the way to be involved in sort of the core work. And unfortunately, I guess there's a certain dependence there on that being a sort of one of the hospitals that we're working with on the programme. And I've alluded a couple of times as well to the UK IBD registry, but that's also another another mechanism by which people can get involved in health data research for IBD.
Yes, as Mark said, and there was a question in the chat from somebody who actually doesn't require hospital care. For the IBD bioresource, at the moment recruitment is through hospital clinics, and we've got over 100 hospitals across England that are involved in the IBD bioresource, and recruitment will be usually through an approach from the clinicians or nurses within the clinic, but patients can obviously make their own inquiries. The wider bioresource, people can sign up to that, and there's details on the website about how you might do that.
We've got a question around consent again, sort of around consent, from Marika, who says NHS numbers are identifiable data. Goodness, I'm tripping over my tongue at this stage. How do we explain to patients during the consent process that that data is identifiable? And perhaps we could just talk more widely around the consent process for we know more about the bioresource, but it's similar at the registry, I mentioned.
So one of the things that patients consent to when they join the bioresource is access to their medical records. And obviously that will involve their NHS number, but much more wider information about their health contained in their medical records. The issue is what we then do with that data, and how we make it accessible, and whether it's anonymized or not. And there that comes back to the consent. And where we're going to be using potentially identifiable data, that would normally be done with a separate project, with a separate ethics, and with the consent of the individual patient.
And if I'm right, John, then there's a difference between what the researchers who are using gut reaction data could see, because they would never see patient identifiable data, and what some specialist staff at the bioresource who have permission to see that data can see. Would you say that's right?
Yes, and even within the bioresource, there will be differences in what people can see, so that we are making it that it is not easy to identify people who are part of the bioresource.
Okay, that makes sense. So again, as I sort of said earlier, lots and lots of layers of security to make sure that no one who can see, only the people who absolutely need to can see identifiable data, and certainly no one who's using as a researcher the data in gut reaction would be able to see even something like an NHS number with the mark. That would all come out in the anonymization, pseudonymization. We have another question around the data review process. A person asks, do we have doctors as well as patients reviewing data requests? So what experts do we have on our data review committee?
Yes, we have patients, we have clinicians, and we have people who will be well versed in the technical aspects of data security, and scientists who can give us advice on feasibility, the power of the study, whether it is actually going to yield the results that the researchers want.
Okay, so we've got there's a range of expertise who looks at each question, don't they, before it goes past. Mark, I can see you've put your hand up to answer this next question. Do you want me to read it out for you before you ask it? It's another good one. We're getting some really fantastic questions through. So George asks, if we have different consent scopes in different data gathering organizations, how can we share data between them?
No, well, this is brilliant, because there are some really, really insightful questions.
There are. It's fantastic.
Today. So yeah, I think, so when we use data for anything for research, there are a number of safeguards or sets of rules that we need to adhere to. So the common one that everyone will have heard of is GDPR, for example. There is also a common law duty of confidentiality, which means that we need to be making it clear and transparent. So any individual can reasonably, easily find out how data about them might be being used. And this is in sort of privacy statements and things on websites quite usually. And when any NHS data is involved, and the data is identifiable, which it clearly needs to be if we're going to be able to link it between two sources, for example. So John touched on this just now, but there also needs to be NHS research ethics approval in place for a particular study. So there's three sets of assurance we need to do there. So, and in terms of where that research actually takes place, it will depend on the organisation driving it, for example. And I think has been clear, but the gut reaction programme is a partnership. It's not a separate organisational entity. We're not responsible. Gut reaction isn't a thing that can be accountable for data in its own right. For the bioresource, that works through Cambridge University Hospitals. The UK IBD registry is another accountable organisation, And we need to be clear in each case who's the data controller for data and who are data processors, and that there's a legal basis in place for doing anything with data along that pathway. So the organization that data sits under for a particular study will be predicated on who has those things in place for the particular study that's being done and who's leading on it. I hope that makes that clear. So data can be done within the within the sort of the bioresource environment and the TRE that's been built as part of the gut reaction program, the research environment that's been built at AIMS. There are also circumstances where if where the bioresource is sufficiently assured that those permissions are in place elsewhere, then with a data sharing agreement in place with setting out clearly how the data can be used and disposed of and everything else, then there are occasions when the data can leave the bioresource to go into another environment for that data to be done with the right assurances in place.
Again, one of our later webinars is going to be with some of the experts from AIMS and Privitar around what we even mean by a trustworthy research environment and what that looks like and how we use it to keep the data safe. Right, so we are coming up to the end of our session, but there's just a few more questions that we've got. One of them is whether or not we have any data from GP surgeries.
No is the short answer.
That was quick.
It's really quite difficult. So we have looked and we've explored a number of different avenues. There's obviously been quite a lot of public debate and concern raised about general practice data being used for research, in a de-identified form, without consent, if you like. But the rules, as I was alluding to before, about who controls and use of the data, using primary care data or GP practice data means getting agreement from the individual GP practices and also the NHS commissioners of that data, depending on which bit we're talking about. So to be gathering it at scale requires agreements with lots of different separate organisations, and logistically that's just very, very difficult. No, it's hospital data that we're dealing with for now and probably for the foreseeable future, or at least in the near term.
I suppose it's a bit cheeky, but looking at your crystal ball then, Mark, would you say that kind of perhaps one of the wider goals of the Hub program, more in its kind of most zoomed out view, is to look at ways that might eventually be possible for those that were interested in it?
And so I'm being hesitant because I don't want to be too sort of uncorporate, if you like. The issue is that when we have sort of big national programs about data use, the consequences of getting that wrong can be really quite damaging. And if you look at the research in this space, there was an initiative called Care.Data in 2014, where that messaging was sort of was misjudged, or it was assumed that people would be okay with it, and they weren't. And so the need to involve and take patients with you and the wider public about how data are being used is absolutely critical. There are a number of research papers written about learning the lessons from that. Unfortunately, if you like, a number of those issues were raised again by the General Practice Data for Planning and Research Initiative a little bit more recently, with headlines again around that, which again has heightened people's nervousness about doing it, and this really is why I'm just such a huge advocate for the NIHR bioresource and the way that they are doing this, because it is consent driven. This isn't about taking people's data, everybody's data, and de-identifying it and saying that will be okay for everyone. This is just working with people who've given consent for their data to be used, and I think the transparency and the confidence that people can have as a consequence, I think, is just fantastic.
And then would you say that as organisations, when we've got patients that are happy to take part in research, who are consenting to do so, that one of the things we're trying to learn as a hub is how do we share that data safely, effectively, quickly to answer these research questions? Would you say that's kind of one of our central learnings that we're aiming for?
I think you've just summarised it brilliantly, Amanda. But yeah, exactly that. How do you keep data safe, but make it easy so you can get the insights and the benefits, coming back to benefits again, as quickly and efficiently as possible for people, but operating in a way that people are comfortable with and can have confidence in.
And that would definitely be the dream. So there are a few questions left in the chat that are mostly comments and that I think that we've covered. There's one that says, have we ever had a problem with data safety? That I think we can answer fairly quickly.
No.
Lovely. And again, we will, without wanting to sound dismissive of that, because it is a serious question and we will cover it, but we have our 2 sessions that look very specifically around how we take very good care of this data. Thank you so much to both John and Mark for talking today. I hope as audience members you have heard some of the excitement that we as a hub feel around what we're doing, that you have heard how much we want to bring patients with us and how deeply we value your ideas and your thoughts around how we should run the hub and particularly the questions that we would ask. Hope to see you again. We hope that you'll keep asking questions and that if you would like to, that you would be able to join up and have your data be part of something like Gut Reaction. So have a lovely rest of your day, everyone, and we hope to see you again soon.